We continue now at the top of Daf Beis Amud Beis Meseches Zevachim. This is 2b. On the previous Amud, Rava said that if a person sacrifices, let's say, a korban ola shelo lishma, he slaughters it shelo lishma. So that doesn't mean that he should do the subsequent avodos, let's say the zrikas adam. He shouldn't do that lechatchila shelo lishma also, just because he started out shelo lishma. And the Gemara in the previous Amud said that we have a source from this from the pasuk. The pasuk is in Sefer Devarim. It talks about that motzos fasecha, what the person says, the person should keep. And the pasuk mentions neder, and then it mentions nedava. And so the Gemara therefore asks, is it an adava? Nederhu, you said it was a neder, then you're saying it's an adava. Which one is it? What does the pasuk mean? Ella, rather, here's how you interpret the pasuk. Im kamashin adarta asisa, if you did what you promised, what you made in your oath, yehei neder, then it will be a neder. V'im lo, and if not, nedava yehei, then it will be counted as a nedava. Unedava mishari l'shanu yeba, and if it is an adava something you can change, and so therefore you see from the pasuk this idea that again the subsequent avodos you shouldn't do, shelo l'shma, you should not deviate. Rashi explains nederhu to ha kasher nadarta ksiv. It says in the pasuk kasher nadarta, then it's calling it an adava. V'yesh chiluk bein neder l'nedava. There's a difference between a neder and a nedava, because neder to amar harei olai. Neder means the person says it's upon me an obligation to bring a korban ola. Unedava harezu. An nedava is when a person says about a particular animal, this animal should be a korban ola. So those are fundamentally different. And so we darsh in the pasuk im kemash nadarta asisa. If you're doing what you promised, sha'avad avodosel lishma, meaning you bring the korban lishma, yehei neder, then it's a neder. V'yal lezet linidrecha, and this will count as a fulfillment of your neder. V'im lav, if not, yehei linidava, it will be an adava, meaning ki'ilu hisnadafta lazen adava acheres v'lo l'shem harishona, as if it was a different donation, but it's not going to count for your first promise, for your first oath. And in any case, the point is, unedava mishari l'shanu yeba, if we're counting it as an adava, can that be changed? V'kevan derachmana kirya nedava, once the pasuk is calling it an adava, meaning you did it shelo lishma, so now it doesn't count for your neder, but it's still being referred to as an adava. Mishari l'shanu yeba, is it permitted to deviate and to do it again shelo lishma? It's not permitted. Ho'amrinu be'perak sheni, we say in perak sheni also l'chashev b'kodshim v'yalef mikra di lo yechashev v'hachim midrash kra, and so you should darshan the pasuk as follows: im motzas fasecha tishmor v'yasisa ozi a neder. Again, if you do what you're supposed to do, you do it lishma, it's a neder. Asher nadarta v'im lav nedava, and if not, it is a nedava. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Ravina le Rapapa, Ravina said to Rapapa, Lo havis gabon biursa, bitchuma becharmach, you were not with us last night in the tchum, in the boundary of becharmach, durami Rava mili mal yasa hadadi, because Rava had a contradiction of superior statements that were made in the Mishnayos, meaning to say, he had a contradiction of Mishnayos, one against the other, v'shani luhu, and he answered up the contradiction. And the Gemara continues and explains, my mili mal yasa, what were these superior words, what were these statements which contradicted one another, which he answered? Tanan, because we learned in our Mishnah, Kol hazvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman v'chulu. It says in our Mishnah that any karbanos which are slaughtered shelo lishma, so those are going to be kosher, but again they're not going to count for the bailim. They're not going to count for the owners. So time with the shelo lishman. So it sounds like the Mishnah is saying the reason why they're not going to count for the owners is because they were specifically slaughtered shelo lishman. They were slaughtered like for a different karban. Hastama, but let's say they would just be slaughtered with nothing in mind. So then it sounds like olunami lebailim l'shem chova. Then it sounds like the karbanos would even count for towards the obligation of the owner. And alman. So we see from our Mishnah stamanami kilishman dami, that if a person does it stam, a person, let's say, slaughters the animal with no intent, that's the same thing as lishma, and that is not problematic. And so the Gemara continues and asks, Uramini, we have the following contradiction with regards to the halacha by a get isha. It says, Kol haget shenichtav shelo l'shem isha pasul. If a get is written not for the sake of the woman, then it's disqualified. And it happens to be, we know over there, ustam monami pasul. Over there, we say the opposite. Over there, the halacha is, if it's written stam, if it's written no one in mind, it actually is disqualified. Rashi explains, Shelo l'shem isha ha'isha hazos shenichtav l'shem acheres. Let's say it's written for some other woman. Sheshma kashem zu, as the same name. Pasul, it's considered disqualified. Chasav lo l'shma. Ustama nami pasul. And over there we say that even if it's done stam, it's pasul, even if with no intention. Kagonim kasva sofer stam l'shem leya sheyehem mezumen l'kashiyavo adam etzlo. Let's say a sofer, a scribe, writes a get for Leah, but no particular Leah, that it should someone come who happens to have the right name, Shashmo v'shem ishto kain v'yitnanu lo. If a person comes who happens to have a wife who's named Leah, and his wife is also the obviously his name is also in the get, so then he'll give it. Now we're going to ask later on, how do we know that that's true? But we know that that is true, that when it comes to get Isha, stam is pasul. And so that's the contradiction over here. When it comes to karbonos, it seems that stam is kosher, and when it comes to get Isha, it seems that stam is pasul. Vishani, and he answered the contradiction as follows. Zvachim bistam l'shmon omden. When it comes to karbonos, so even if a person has nothing in mind, but it's assumed that it's going to be lishma. But Isha bistama, but a woman in general, lav l'gerish and omeda, she's not standing, so to speak, waiting to be divorced. Rashi explains, bistaman lishman omdim hilkach kol kama de loakar shemayu behed yahav lishman. We understand automatically, so to speak, that it's lishma, and so therefore, as long as you don't have a contradictory intent, it is going to be considered lishma. But that's not true when it comes to an Isha. That's not true when it comes to a woman in terms of divorce. And the Gemara continues, Uzvachim bistama ksherin minol. Now, how do we know that this is true? That by karbonos, if it's tam, if the person has no intent, it's kosher. From where do we know that? Ilema mehadatanan. If you're going to say it comes from the Mishnah, because the Mishnah says, Kol hazvachim shenizbechu shelo lishman. It says that they were slaughtered specifically not lishman. Velo katani shelo nizbechu lishman. It doesn't say that they weren't slaughtered lishma. It says they were slaughtered shelo lishma. And so that implies that if there was slaughtered with no intent, it would be kosher. But you can't really derive anything from that language, because by get nami hakatani, by get also, it's taught in the same fashion. It says by get, kol haget shenichtav shelo l'shem isha pasul. It says if the get was written shelo l'shem isha pasul, that sounds like there was a negative intent, and it would sound like the same thing. You should say that stam is kosher. V'lo katani shelo nechtav l'shem isha pasul. It doesn't say that it wasn't written l'shem isha, and so therefore, if we don't make that same inference when it comes to get isha, why should we make that inference when it comes to our Mishnah? And so the Gemara instead says, Elameha, rather the source when it comes to karbonos that we say stam is kosher is from the following Mishnah. The Mishnah says, the Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, Ketzad at lishman v'shalo lishman. What's considered lishman and shalo lishman? L'shem pesach u l'shem shlamim. Let's say it's l'shem pesach u l'shem shlamim. So time adamar l'shem pesach u l'shem shlamim. The reason why it's problematic is because he said l'shem pesach l'shem shlamim. Ha l'shem pesach ustama. Let's say l'shem pesach, and then he would have no intent. Kosher, so apparently it would be kosher in that situation. Al mustamon kilishman dami. You see that if it's dam, that's considered to be lishma. And Rashi explains, Ketzad lishman masnisani. This is a Mishnah coming up. L'shem pesach u l'shem shlamim. He has in mind for Pesach. We're talking here about a carbon Pesach, but then he has in mind for shlamim. Kachi shavolov. That's what his intention is. Ha l'shem pesach ustama. So that would sound like if he had in mind for carbon Pesach, but then he just had in mind nothing in mind. Shelo chishav achar of l'shem shlamim. He wasn't thinking l'shem shlamim. Kosher, it's kosher. V'afagav desov shchita stama ishtachit. Even though at the end of the shchita, Rashi understands that what this means is the intention he had at the beginning of the shchita and the intention that he had at the end of the shchita. Other Rishonim have other opinions, but the point is, even though at the end of the shchita it was stam, so apparently it's kosher. It's only problematic if at the end of the shchita he has in mind for shlamim. Alma stamon kilishman dami. You see that having nothing in mind is like lishma. Diika shalo lishman dami, because if it's considered not lishma, havale kilu amar l'shem pesach or l'shem shlamim. It should be the same as l'shem pesach and then l'shem shlamim. But the Gemara continues and says there's no proof from this Mishnah, because Dil Mashani Hasa, maybe it's different over there in a situation where he started out with the right intention, l'shem pesach, and then he had no intention. So there it would be kosher diamar kala osa al das rishon hu osa, because we say whatever he was doing, it was on the understanding of what he started out with. He had an understanding in the beginning of the shechita that it was l'shem pesach. So just because at the end of the shechita he had nothing in mind, it's still going to be kosher in that case, because he started out with the proper intention. That would not prove what the halacha is in a case where the entire thing was done stam, the entire thing was done with no intention at all. And so the Gemara continues, Elami Sefer, rather you can bring a proof from the end of this Mishnah. It said shalo lishman v'lishman. You had a case of the reverse. Let's say it starts out shalo lishman and then it's lishman, which would be again l'shem shlamim u l'shem pesach. That would be starting out l'shem shlamim and then l'shem pesach. So time adamer l'shem shlamim u l'shem pesach. The reason why it's problematic is he starts out l'shem shlamim and then he does l'shem pesach. Hastama u l'shem pesach kosher. But let's say he started out with no intention, but at the end he does l'shem pesach. The end of the shechita is l'shem pesach. Apparently that would be kosher, and so that should be a proof that stam is still kosher. kosher. But the Gemara says, no, dil mashani hasam. Again, you could say similar to above, maybe over there. Diyamar yochiach sofu al tchilasu, because we could say the end proves the beginning. Since the end he had in mind the proper intention, so even though in the beginning he had no intention, but still that's considered to be okay. Inami, or you can say that the seif of the Mishnah can't be a proof, because Aidi detana lishmon v'shalo lishmon, once we already have a case in the Mishnah, the first part of the Mishnah, of lishmon and then shalo lishmon, so tananami shalo lishmon v'lishmon. So then the Mishnah balances out its language with a case of shalo lishmon and lishmon, but you can't necessarily make any inference. We just have a parallel case. We just have parallel cases in the Mishnah in order to contrast one case from the other. And so the Gemara continues, Elameha, rather the proof that stam is lishmo when it comes to karbanos comes from the following. The Mishnah says, L'shem shisha devarim hazevach nizbach. The carbon is slaughtered for 6 things. L'shem zevach, it's for that particular carbon. L'shem zoveach, for the person bringing the carbon. L'shem shem, for Hashem. L'shem ishim, for the fires. L'shem reach, for the aroma. L'shem nichoach, for the pleasantness. V'achatas v'yoshim, l'shem chet. And the chatas and the yoshim, you also have in mind the particular sin. Amar Rabbi Yossi says, Afmi shalohaya belibo l'shem achas mikolelu. Even somebody who doesn't have in mind for one of these things, kosher, it's still kosher. Shetanai bezinu, that's a condition of the court. Asnu bezdin delo leimu lishmo. The bezin makes a condition that you shouldn't say it's for the sake of this particular idea. Dilma asi l'meimar shalo lishmo, because maybe the person's going to come to do it shalo lishmo. And so the Gemara says, V'salka daitach stam apostle. Now, if it should enter your mind that having no intention is disqualified, kaimi bezdin umasni milsa de mifsal bay, is the bezdin, is the court going to get up and make a stipulation that makes it disqualified? The whole implication of the Mishnah is that no intention is still going to be kosher. And the Gemara continues, V'gabe get the stam apostle minalan. From where do we know by get isha that if a person has nothing in mind, that it is going to be disqualified? Ilema mehadatanan. If you say it comes from the following Mishnah by get isha, haya over b'shuk v'shama sofra makrin ish ploni geirish plonis mimakam ploni. Let's say a person's going through the marketplace, he hears the scribe, and the scribe is writing down so-and-so is divorcing so-and-so from such and such a place. V'yamar, and the person says to himself, Zeh shemi v'zeh shem ishti, this is my name, this is the name of my wife, I could use that get. Pasal legarish bo, it's disqualified, you can't use that for a gerishin. And so there it seems to be a situation of stam, it's being written with no intention, and we see that it's disqualified. But the Gemara says, no, Dilma kidder Rapapa, maybe over there it's disqualified like Rapapa says. Diyamar Rapapa, because Rapapa says, Hacha b'sofrim ho'asuyin lehislamid askinon. Here we're talking about scribes, they're just training how to write the get. So it's not only that they don't have in mind in terms of the person, they don't even have in mind that this should be a get at all. V'lo echtiv l'shum krisis klal, this wasn't written for any kind of separation at all, and that's why that's already problematic. Maybe that wouldn't prove a regular case of stam. And so the Gemara continues, Ela mehar, rather it comes from the following source. And Rashi explains, L'shem shisha devarim, for 6 things, Mishnah b'perek Beis Shammai, u'mikro yolef l'hu. This is a Mishnah in Perek Beis Shammai later on, and it's learned out from Psukim, L'shem zevach, L'shem mash hukdash, for this particular carbon, L'shem zoveach, she yischaper bo ba'olav. It means to say that the owner should get the kapara, the atonement, v'lo she yischaper bo acher, someone else shouldn't get the atonement, L'shem shem la'akadosh baruch hu, shamar v'nasa ritzonu, it's for HaKadosh baruch hu, L'shem ishim la'aktiram, to burn them, v'lo la'asosam tzliel ha'mizbeach, not to make them roasted on the mizbeach, L'shem reach lafuke evarm shetzlon vehelon teshuvein bohen reach. That's to exclude, let's say you have limbs which were roasted and then offered, there's no more smell. And l'shem nichoach, l'shem hanochas ruach la'kadosh baruch hu, again, that it should be a pleasantness for HaKadosh baruch hu, she'amar v'nasa ritzono, that his will was done. And Rashi continues that Rabbi Yossi said, shelo haya belibo lishmo, let's say he didn't have in mind lishmo, elastam, it just had no intention, v'lo hisker echad me'ela, he didn't mention any of these things. Shetanai bezenu, that's a condition of the court, yishchitu stam, that you should slaughter stam. V'lo yazkiru b'shchitasin lishmo. You shouldn't mention during the slaughtering that it's lishmo. Kidem afarish time of yazal asnu bezin de loleim lishmon, as the Gemara here goes on to explain. V'gabe get the stam apostle manali. Where do we know that a get, if it's stam, it's disqualified? Kolomer hechi shamalei rava mimas nisin. Where did Rava see from a Mishnah to get in the apostle the tikshilei or ramini adadi, that he understood that it's possible by get, and therefore there was a contradiction? And Rashi continues, Makrin is calling out as a talmidin shemilam osan lichtov tov segit, and the person is teaching the students how to write the get. To lo ichtiv l'shem krisas klal, but then the Gemara said maybe it's different when it's not written to be a get at all. Aval hechad ichtiv l'shem krisas, but let's say it was written to be a get. Shehei mezumin lo l'kashi is damin lo megarish sheshmo v'shem ishto shavan bo kasher. In other words, let's say it was written that it should be a get. Should we find the person with the same name and his wife has the same name? So then maybe it actually would be kasher. kosher. Maybe only when it's l'shem, when it's lacking the creases completely, it's not kosher. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Gimel Amud Aleph.